Hi, everyone. Hope you can all see me. Thank you for attending our Camera on Campus online panel. My name is Eitan Fishberger, and I am Camera's campus coordinator in Israel. We are very excited to have so many student activists joining us today from around the world, as well as over a dozen pro-Israel organizations co-sponsoring this event, showcasing the international reach and need for our activism. In a moment, I'll introduce our guests, but before I do so, I would like to tell you about Camera and Camera on Campus and a little bit about what we do. Camera is a nonpartisan international media research organization. We aim to correct inaccurate information presented in the media to ensure that the public is receiving a correct representation of Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict. In the campus department, we focus on correcting misinformation that may appear in university newspapers, syllabi, or by invited guest speakers. We provide assistance to students through our two programs, the Camera Fellowship and the Camera on Campus Coalition. The Camera Fellows across the US, Canada, the UK, and Israel combat these issues by writing articles, hosting educational events, workshops, and by distributing thoroughly sourced infographics and other resources, both on campus and on social media. The Cameras on Campus Coalition supports independent student-led Israel organizations aiming to help empower the students to be the trusted pro-Israel voices on their campus. Each summer, students from both programs attend our international training conference, and this summer, given the unique circumstances, we'll be running a virtual conference for the students on Zoom. Applications for the fellowship have been extended to July 1st due to popular demand, and you'll get an email about it after the event tonight. At this time, please make yourself aware of the Zoom functions at the bottom of your screen. To get things started, please introduce yourself in the chat box with your name, your location, and the university you attend. We will be using the Q&A function to take questions. Questions will be answered after our moderator and the panelists have finished their conversation, but feel free to place your questions throughout the talk as they come up. I'm now happy to introduce our guest speakers. Dov Guggenheim, a Camera Fellow at Hebrew University in Israel, will be moderating tonight's event. Dov made Aliyah on his own at the age of 16 out of a deeply ingrained sense of Zionism and Jewish ideals, and his entire life has been dedicated to furthering these causes. Currently a student at Hebrew U and living in Jerusalem, Dov is involved in many student causes as well as city and nationwide political movements. He also works as an analyst at the Bank of Israel. Our first panelist is Esther Walker, a Camera Fellow at King's College London, currently pursuing her BA in history. By attending an increasingly hostile and highly politicized university, Esther was encouraged to be proactive about her beliefs and is extremely passionate about advocating for Israel. Avi Fagan, a Camera Fellow at the engineering student at York University, is our second panelist tonight. Avi currently works on various projects related both to his engineering degree and the global and local political situation regarding Israel. Our third panelist is Maya Reuven, a Camera Fellow and second-year student at the University of California, Berkeley, studying economics and data science. Maya serves as Vice President of Bears for Israel and as an executive board member of the Tikva Zionist Voice at Berkeley, two pro-Israel groups on campus. She also writes for the Berkeley Political Review and is a member of the Delta Gamma sorority. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Dov, Esther, Avi, and Maya. Dov, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Eitan, for that nice and kind introduction, and thank you everybody for attending and taking time out of your busy schedules and hearing about these important issues. I'm going to get straight to it and address a little bit of a elephant in the room. Why is the Israeli moderating an event speaking about campus anti-Semitism as it pertains to the BDS movement? We don't have too much BDS here in Israel specifically, and it's less of a headline catcher, at least at face value. I would respond to that question with, that's not so true for a couple of reasons. It affects us as Israelis on a day-to-day basis for a myriad of reasons, be it our tax shkalim, our tax dollars going towards fighting BDS causes through various government institutions, to struggles in the business world, to the fact that students are exchange students also in universities all around the world and have to face hostilities on a day-to-day basis in international schools as well, anti-Semitism when going on trips, and the big one is, of course, the BDS movement and other anti-Israel movements are a direct derivative of radical causes that sometimes express themselves through terrorism here in Israel, unfortunately, be it through the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Hamas, or others. Today we'll be focusing on campus anti-Semitism and its influence on campus life and those affected by this dangerous phenomenon. I'd like to point out that, of course, not everybody feels campus anti-Semitism is expressed in different ways on different campuses all around the world. There are many views, and it is a very tough issue to address, but it is one that we all have felt in different ways, and thus we've felt it important to address these issues. Anti-Semitic events happen all around the world in many different, and it takes many shapes and sizes, and it is an important issue to address. When it comes to anti-Semitism on campus and anti-Zionism, it's an interesting cross sometimes. It takes various forms. In Israel here, it's terrorist attacks on various campuses. It's hostilities on various panels, to not being very welcoming to many students because of their Jewish or Zionist identity, and et cetera, et cetera. Much ink has been spilled on this topic. Varying views on free speech, ethnicity, nationality, and moral takes and dissenting opinions on the realms of national self-determination, public security, public health, especially in the Corona era, and this through the lens of lawmakers, politicians, economists, people who shape public opinion, professors. This issue has borne much material, and it sparked quite a discussion here that we felt needed to be held in an open forum. Now then, as I previously mentioned, security concerns are a major sticking point here in Israel. There was many terrorist attacks targeted specifically at students, like the 2002 bombing of Hebrew U, which happened in the Hebrew U cafeteria from a Hamas cell that was located a couple hundred meters away from the university. But security concerns and threats to Jewish life on campus has happened elsewhere as well, from Europe to North America and all across the world. Which actually brings me to my first question, which I'd like to direct towards Esther Walker of King's College London University. Esther, I would like to ask you, Esther, you here? Hi.
Hi.
How would you like to judge the response of the King's College London administration to what often turns to violent anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist incidents? There's been many on your campus. We'd love for you to maybe point one out. And how does that affect the physical safety of Jewish and or Zionist students on campus vis-a-vis these certain pro-Palestinian groups and their targets?
Thank you so much, Joel, for the question. I'd first just like to thank both you and Eitan for the introduction, and Camera on Campus for inviting me to speak with such fantastic other panelists. It's truly an honor. Hi, everybody. I'm Esther. I've just completed my studies at King's College London, where I studied history. To give some context of the situation at my university, Action Palestine is a large and active society. They're very present on social media, and they host a variety of events, which generally have high turnouts. For example, this past January, Action Palestine hosted a diverse panel of speakers representing different minority and oppressed groups. For example, Black repression. This was presented alongside BDS founder Omar Barghouti, representing the Palestinian voice. This forces artificial links between essentially unrelated causes in an attempt to further fuel animosity towards Israel on campus by uniting these groups in their oppression. I, alongside other students, attended this event, wanting to engage in peaceful dialogue, which was shut down when one of us asked a question. This video is on Facebook. This is in comparison to the violent and disruptive protests of Action Palestine at our Israel Society events. During the event, speakers made provocative comparisons between the Holocaust and Palestinian suffering. This is a common rhetorical trope of BDS supporters who construct a crude and political repurposing of the Holocaust by advancing an anti-Semitic portrayal of Jews as perpetrators of crimes they have suffered by framing the alleged crimes of the IDF as equivalent to those of the Nazis. This is needlessly provocative and undoubtedly creates an inaccurate dichotomy which ignores the entirely different context and omits any wrongdoing committed by Arab forces towards Israel. This, unfortunately, is not an isolated event in universities in London. For at a UCL Friends of Palestine event in 2017, the speaker directly compared Zionists to Nazis. This event, and many others like it, are obstruction towards open dialogue and debate, for there's not a space to challenge the poisonous one-sided argument presented, as seen by the events that happened when we attended their event. Whilst at the Omar Barghouti event, there wasn't significant violence, At many other events that we, the Israel Society, have hosted, there has been. This past November, we hosted former IDF Lieutenant Colonel Eyal Dror, who discussed Israel's remarkable humanitarian mission in Syria. This was despite the harrowing and aggressive protests of a coalition of Action Palestine group, amongst other student societies such as Students for Syria, which was part of a well-designed strategy of disruption and intimidation. I do not support non-platforming, and I'm an advocate for free speech. However, the KCI administration has continuously failed to uphold its commitment against speech that discriminates based on race or religion, and thereby has abandoned the responsibility to protect Jewish and Zionist students on campus. This is despite the positive adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. There is most certainly a double standard on campus. Safe space marshals are deployed at Israel Society and other society events, but not at Action Palestine events where they spout their hatred. They are favoured and are given more leniency by the administration than other groups. If the university are going to employ these solutions, then why not employ them even-handedly? This negligence by the KCL administration should be worrying for all students, not just those who are Jewish or who are pro-Zionist, but all students on campus.
Thank you so much, Esther. What you brought up is definitely extremely concerning. The lack of physical safety you guys feel, or the double standards and shirking of international norms of what is considered bigotry and anti-Semitism, that actually does connect to what I wanted to talk with Avi about. Avi from York University in Canada. You've also had some disturbing events over in Canada, and I wanted to hear from you, how does the anti-Israel bias and the anti-Zionist, anti-Semite often bias manifest itself on your campus? Do you also feel physically threatened, similarly to the situation in England? What's the university's response to these anti-Semitic incidents? Specifically, maybe you want to bring up what happened with the reservists on duty past year.
For sure. Thank you, Dov, and thank you, Eitan, and thank you, Esther and Camera on campus. Yeah, so we've also had physical altercations on campus from anti-Semitic forces. But what's interesting in our case is actually our official institutions are the one leading the charge. The student body, the YFS, actually invited Antifa, certain politicians, Holocaust denier, and basically incited a riot on campus against an organization that was brought there before, and that was simply there for dialogue and discussion. Someone actually was sent to the hospital. I personally was in the event, and there was actual legitimate threats of violence. The police had to get involved. They were actually just trying to surround the auditorium where we were in to box us in to give us no escape. I know several students had nervous breakdowns in the auditorium itself. 2 girls left, had to be escorted out by police because they were worried about leaving an auditorium on campus, unsupervised. It's unacceptable.
Wow, that is definitely unacceptable. I agree with that, and it's heartbreaking to hear that that's the situation. Would you say that this situation causes there to be unrest amongst the students and a lack of security amongst the students? How does it make the students, specifically Zionist students, but also if you want to speak about non-politically aligned students, how does it make them feel?
So I know Jewish students who try and come to campus as little as possible. All the Jewish organizations warned us away from the campus the day of because there was real concerns that people would be injured, as they were. And I mean, it's a big campus, so 60,000 students, I'm sure, are not all aware of it, but it makes everyone uncomfortable to know that at any moment, certain forces associated with the university are riling up people to essentially riot on campus against ethnicities they don't like, nationalities they don't like, and it's unbelievable. There are many organizations on campus that are cultural that have actually forced out Jewish students, and I've actually experienced this myself. But for example, I know someone who runs the LGBT for Hillel on campus, and they were told that they weren't allowed to participate in the LGBT groups on campus because they were part of Hillel, so he had to go and create his own. I was asked to leave a Black Student Society space because I was Jewish. I was wearing a kippah at the time, And these are groups that actually get funding, serious financial assistance, both from the school and from the student bodies.
That's definitely, again, heartbreaking to hear, and very disappointing too that it comes from the university level and university funding. That actually reminds me of what's happening a little bit in Berkeley, where Maya attends. Maya, I'm sure you're aware of the situation over in Berkeley, where you guys might face a little bit less of a physical altercation, but you guys have a lot of discrimination from the university level. There's a lot of from either the student bodies or university or professors themselves. What's the political atmosphere like regarding pro and anti-Israel groups? Maybe you can give us a primer on that. Is there room for civilized debate by you guys at all? How does that manifest itself by you guys over in California?
Yeah, thanks, Dove, and thank you, Camera, for organizing this incredible event. I'm so honored to be sitting on this panel with such incredible students. I know Berkeley has a bit of a reputation for having this big protest culture, but really the issues we're dealing with on campus extend far beyond just these big demonstrations on our main plaza. Some you would expect when anti-Zionist groups are clearly crossing the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, but we're also dealing with some more complicated issues like anti-normalization or the corruption of the intersectionality movement, or even the institutionalization of anti-Semitism at the faculty level. And I might not have time to touch on all of those topics right now, but I know we'll be discussing them throughout the rest of the panel. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the more blatant expressions of anti-Semitism on campus. A perfect example of this was an event that happened this past February. Bears for Palestine, which is the more popular version of Students for Justice in Palestine on campus, has a rented university space, as many student organizations do. Most of these student organizations use their spaces to organize events, organize club meetings, keep materials. But Bears for Palestine used their space to basically make this display, this memorial for convicted terrorists who had murdered Jewish civilians in Israel, including Rasmia Odeh, who was responsible for the murder of 2 Hebrew University students in a supermarket in Jerusalem. So the Jewish community was outraged by this, especially in light of all of the domestic terrorism, we've been experiencing in the United States with the Jewish community, as we've seen in Pittsburgh and Poway, Jersey City, and Muncie. Seeing figures that have committed similar attacks just in Israel was really disheartening for the community and made us feel very unsafe walking around campus. So fortunately, one of our student organizations took action, Tikva, and drafted this resolution asking student government to condemn the glorification of terror on our campus, which you would think wouldn't be so controversial. And unfortunately, you'd be wrong. The Jewish community was able to organize. We mobilized, a huge portion of us showed up, which was really beautiful to see. Berkeley is such a great Jewish community, and it doesn't get enough credit for it because of all the anti-Semitism. But unfortunately, the second we all showed up to this meeting, the environment was instantly hostile. Jewish students were being shoved around, we were being called names. Anti-Zionist students brought signs targeting individual Jewish students in the room. And as each of us walked up to give our speech, anti-Zionist protesters would scream to try to drown out everything we were saying. They would call us Nazis, white supremacists, and of course the moderator was no help. She had her own ties to the BDS movement, and it only escalated from there too. At a certain point, many Jewish students were receiving physical threats of violence from anti-Zionist students in the room, myself included. And at that point, the Jewish community just felt we were being completely disrespected. We felt unsafe, so we got up and left in protest. And I wish it ended there, but the chanting continued from the anti-Zionist students. They followed us out of the room. They stole our signs, even the pictures of the victims of Rasmia Odeh's terrorist attack, and ripped them up in front of us and threw them away. And ultimately the meeting was adjourned, postponed to a later time, where the bill was voted down. not surprising again, because the student government historically has not been so pro-Israel. But it was really disheartening for the Jewish community to see anyway, especially after experiencing such anti-Semitism, and just to see the bill fail was really disheartening. And unfortunately, that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's all these interactions that occur in between these massive blowups of anti-Semitism that just make each instance progressively worse. And those interactions that I'm talking about are like the anti-normalization, the idea that even talking to a Zionist student is so horrible because you're legitimizing us for believing in the Jewish right to self-determination, or how intersectionality, which began as such a beautiful thing, of minorities lifting each other up, has now been turned into something to leave Jews out and turn them into the oppressor. And all of this rhetoric is now just legitimized by professors that are delivering the same rhetoric in the classroom and legitimizing it, making it really hard to have a productive dialogue on campus.
Wow, that's, as you said, disheartening. You actually mentioned no platforming, which is really interesting. I wanted to actually ask you guys, this is an open question to any of the panelists. I would love to hear some the dissenting viewpoints, maybe. It could be an interesting one. Is no platforming a good solution, at least how they use it to combat what they view as evil as Zionism? Could it be a useful tool at all, maybe for the Zionists and the Jewish community towards anti-Semitic groups? Can it be a useful tool? Is it a useful tool?
I think absolutely not. I think non-platforming removes freedom of speech, and I also think it's double-sided. For example, here in the UK, Ambassador Mark Regev, he is frequently protested against speaking at UK universities. If he was denied this platform, it's completely double-sided, and I think it's not something that should be supported by universities. However, there most definitely should be limitations if people frequently spout hateful speech and poisonous rhetorics. They most definitely shouldn't be given a platform by the university. But I think it's not for the student university groups to then go about non-platforming, because, as I said, it's a double-sided situation.
Right, it's striking an interesting balance of free speech versus no platforming. It's definitely an interesting balance. Alvia, I'd like to hear your take on no platforming. Can it be good? When does it infringe on free speech for the student groups on campus? Should governments get...
So there's obviously been a lot of ink spilled on free speech issues, both in the US and Canada. It's a very difficult topic, but I'm a free speech absolutist. I think if you shut people up, you're telling them that you're afraid of what they have to say. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't, I also believe in the right of people to protest speakers they disagree with, or to debate their ideas. So I think a policy that would allow open and free debate on university campuses to prevent chaos is reasonable. But I think even the worst types, it's better to have what they're saying aired out in the open and then to address it than it is to actually deplatform someone. Now, in the US, for example, the obvious exceptions are direct calls to violence, crying fire in an open, in a movie theater, these sorts of direct calls for treason or terrorism or violence. I could see maybe a case for canceling such people, but otherwise, I'd much rather hear what the opposition has to say, because to be quite honest, they often don't have anything interesting to say, and then people suspect that, well, why do you want them shut up? So I'd much rather, Mark Twain used to say, better to be silent and be thought of a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt.
Mm-hmm. So that was some interesting points you brought up, and actually leading back to a question I want to direct a little bit also towards Berkeley, but of course towards all the panelists. Maya, I would like to ask you, you're in Berkeley, which is one of the beacons of free speech, or at least that's how it's known in the academic world. And then, of course, you pitted that against empirical evidence that sometimes they're quite against free speech and pro-harassment of certain student bodies. I'm just going to ask you point blank, do you feel safe as a Jew and or as a Zionist? Do you feel there's space to be intellectually curious there, especially as it comes to hot button issues such as Jewish life on campus, Israel, Palestine, Zionist groups and non-Zionist groups? How do you feel on campus there?
Yeah, it's a complicated question because, as you mentioned, there's a lot of nuances in feeling safe as a Jew, feeling safe as a Zionist, and feeling safe as an outspoken Jew and as an outspoken Zionist. So as a Jew on campus, I am not afraid to walk around with a Magen David. My friends wear a kippah. No one's afraid that they're going to get jumped in the middle of the day or at night. In that respect, it's safe. We feel safe. As a Zionist, it gets a little bit more complicated. As I mentioned before, I think as a Zionist physically, if you're not super outspoken about it, it's also fine. People will wear like an IDF t-shirt around campus and maybe you'll get some dirty glares. Maybe on a bad day, someone will shout something at you, but you're not gonna get beat up. Things get a little dicier when you take like more of an outspoken position on campus. So for example, like me and some of my fellow like pro-Israel group leaders have been targeted a couple times, not physically, it's only threats, thank goodness. Let's hope it doesn't escalate any further. But sometimes it will make me second guess certain places that I'll go or people I'll go with. Now, intellectually, it gets really complicated. I personally actually entered UC Berkeley as a political science and Middle Eastern studies major. I was really interested in the politics of the Middle East, really excited to start taking classes. And I knew that Berkeley had a reputation. So I did my research about my professor in my introduction to Near East Studies class. He seemed fine. His focus was in ancient Mesopotamia. So I enrolled in the class and it was so horrendously anti-Israel, crossing the lines between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism left and right, that it was very uncomfortable to be a Zionist in that class. And very uncomfortable to be outspoken about it. In my discussion section, when my GSI passed out an article comparing Israel to apartheid South Africa, I spoke up and was attacked by one of the Palestinian students in the room. She stood up and interjected and told me that my family stole her family's homeland and that I was a Nazi. And this is all in the middle of class, and my GSI sat there and did nothing. And unfortunately, I'm used to it, so it was okay for me, but for other people, like that could be completely devastating. And we shouldn't have to put up with that in the classroom. So no, intellectually, I don't think Zionist students are safe on campus.
I can definitely see how being called a Nazi would be make you feel unsafe intellectually on campus. That makes sense. Esther, what are your takes on this? A history major in London. I'm sure you have a take on this.
Sure, absolutely. So to begin with, academic literature at my university, from my experience, is most definitely one-sided. University professors, they'll give their opinions, which they remain unchallenged within class, which is often the result of academics generally being left-leaning, which is not to say that left-leaning individuals cannot be Zionists, but the prevalence of both academia and students to be left-wing creates this one-sided opinion. Students often would feel hostile to express opposing and challenging ideas, meaning that they would remain silent in face of intimidation. I can tell you from my own experience, I did a module last year on the history of the Middle East. I was the only pro-Zionist student within the entire course. The literature that we studied only gave, a path of history which I personally do not believe in, and the path that I do believe in is not considered and is not given within the literature provided by the professor. this is very, very misleading for students who are not knowledgeable on the topic. For it, it kind of forces them to create opinions without knowing the full picture. It's very troubling. The solution is, you know, I don't know what the solution is, but it's a big problem.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's when university professors start, you know, presenting things as one-sided and not giving the whole picture, that creates obviously one-sided students as a natural result. Avi, what about you? What's the role of faculty regarding anti-Semitism and or anti-Zionism on campus?
Well, it's difficult because I went to an event earlier this year where I had one of the faculty members from the School of Law actually show up and say, and I have a recording of this I took, that essentially Jews are allowed to have their culture as long as it doesn't affect anybody else. Now, imagine a professor at any university in the United States or the West saying, you know, any minority group, blacks or gays or whoever, is only allowed to have their culture as long as nobody else is offended by it. That's absolutely absurd. And how are Jewish students supposed to feel taking a class with such a professor? And it speaks to sort of something that Esther and Maya have been talking about. It's not so much the physical threats, which are very real at times. It's the marginalization and the forcing of Jewish students, and even maybe not Jewish students, but just Christians, conservatives, anyone who doesn't agree with this prevailing viewpoint, into the margins of the school. I've talked to students who were told, I can't tell anybody I'm Jewish, I'll lose all my friends. One of my friends who's trying to run a organization that brings Palestinians and Jews together for dialogue on campus, all his Arab students were threatened on having any dealings with him, that if you do, you'll be kicked out of all your other groups. No one will talk to you. No one will have any dealings with you. It's straight up intimidation, and you know that's a serious form of violence in and of itself, making you a pariah on campus for your political views. Which, you know, if we're talking about making you a pariah because you believe in genocide or something, that's you know, that's understandable. But we're talking about mainstream Jews who've done nothing other than choosing these universities to go to. It's frankly quite unacceptable. I've been spat on in the hallways. Like, is this the kind of open environment of learning and academic freedom that instills, you know, a culture of a great university? I somehow doubt it. This is not acceptable on any level.
Right, I agree. It does seem like it's unacceptable. That's all I can say. Why do you think these anti-Israel groups resort to these hard tactics? And also the professors, why do they join?
Well, because it works. It gets them brownie points with, you know, right now it's really cool to be activist, to be on social media protesting racism and all these causes. And unfortunately, Jews have just ended up, for whatever reason, in the class of your colonialist oppressors, you're evil. And so, you know, the way to get ahead in school, in all these organizations, is to attack anyone who disagrees with you. And they know there's no consequences. Nobody's been fired. No one's been expelled. Even after a riot where people ended up in the hospital, there wasn't a single suspension. There wasn't a single expulsion. And the organizations that are involved are still in power at the school. They didn't even break their contract despite threats of violence and violations of the Ontario Human Rights Code. This is a university that's government run and funded by the province of Ontario, and with a Jewish, the head of the university is actually Jewish, and nothing's happened. So why wouldn't they do it? It's working. Jews are intimidated. Jews are being pushed to the margins, and they're winning. So of course they would do it.
Right. Yeah. No. Unfortunately, there haven't been repercussions, or enough repercussions, I should say, for certain bad actions.
There hasn't been a single ounce of repercussion to any of these people. They're actually still in power as the elected student body of York University. What repercussions have there been?
Maya, you've also had certain collaborations between anti-Zionist professors and students. What do you think, in lieu of actual repercussions being taken on your campus, what do you think the student body, or the Zionist and or the Jewish student bodies, can take concrete steps to help better the situation? Is there something they can do to maybe make the situation a little bit more redeemable in your eyes?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult because you have so many institutions in place that are against you, like these professors, these student groups. And that's why I think the most effective thing that we can do as Zionist students on campus, as Jewish students on campus, is engage in individual conversations with individual people. We talk a lot about, like, in activism, speaking to the 90% and not the 10% that's never going to agree with you. So oftentimes, if we're having a demonstration on our main plaza on campus, there'll be a lot of shouting back and forth between the pro-Israel side and the anti-Israel side. But on the margins, there's always people gathering, watching, and having no idea what's going on. And so taking a step back and just going over and asking, like, hey, can I help answer any questions? Like, what are your thoughts? And those are the people that are willing to engage in dialogue. And you start to realize that it's not that everyone is against us, it's that there's a small minority that are, and they're using their power to try to influence that 90%. And if we can get there first and have a productive dialogue, help them see that this issue is so much more complicated than Israel bad, Palestinians good, or Palestinians bad and Israel good, that's when we can really start to make a difference. And we've seen a lot of success in doing that. It's just a little bit less satisfying because it's very small steps instead of big events. Yeah.
I actually see a question here in the crowd. We'd actually like to hear about some of those successful steps that you've taken. We know there are bad stories. We'd like to hear some of the good ones too.
Yeah. Again, it really is mostly at an individual level. So for example, we have an event every year in honor of Yom HaShoah, where we have people come and light candles in honor of the victims of the Holocaust. And we had someone come up and light a candle. He didn't say anything. And he was kind of hanging around the table and observing for a while. After a while, we started talking to him. He's like, yeah, you know, I'm Palestinian. And for a while, like, I've always been told, like, I can't talk to you guys, or you guys are evil. But he saw us as human in that moment, and we had a beautiful dialogue, talked about some of the issues. Of course, we didn't agree on everything, but that's okay, because he saw us as people. He didn't see us as these evil beings that aren't worthy of being normalized. He saw us as people with a different perspective and a different history. And I can't tell, there's so many instances of that happening, and those are never talked about because they're not as flashy. But it's happening, and it's good work. So, yeah.
All right. I'll be taking some questions from the crowd right now. I see there's a question that was repeated a couple of times I see here was, this is to the panelists in general, do you feel that anti-Israel activism on your campuses has ramped up since you began your studies, or has it remained consistent? Has it gone down maybe? I'm down to hear it has gone down if so. But yeah.
To answer your question, I would say within the UK, anti-Israel activism is definitely correlated with the political climate within the United Kingdom. To give an example, at the end of 2019, we held a general election, which was, you know, it became highly politicized, the left versus the right. And the left is, in the UK, was led by Jeremy Corbyn, who is a friend of Hamas and Hezbollah. So, you know, when he's the leader and the face of the left on campus, you see a massive increase of anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist activities on campus. As a comparison, once he was defeated in the general election and Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, immediately after, I would say that there was a couple of months where it was much quieter from activists. not to say that there wasn't, but I would say within the UK, the climate is dependent on the external political atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Avi, what about you? How's the feeling gone over the past couple of years?
From bad to worse. It just gets worse and worse every year. First year I was here, actually there was a strike, so most students were a little bit upset with some of the left-wing groups who would usually, busy fighting us, were instead fighting the university. But this year it was just an explosion. The Jewish organizations here don't go out of their way to cause trouble, but there was this year a new organization on campus that was overtly trying to, put their name out there and show that Jews were not going to be intimidated or afraid. And that did cause a few, more conflict, just because we'd been lying low for a while. But again, as long they get bolder and bolder every year, they as long as they're in power and they know that no one's willing to stand up to them, they keep winning. So why wouldn't they keep doing what they're doing? This year alone, it was just a really bad year to be a Jewish student on campus. There was absolute overt threats and, like I said, intimidation, too many to list. And from a lot of it was, low level burn from individuals, like I said before. But the official organizations that run the campus, the Graduate Student Association, the YFS, the York Federation of Students, they know nothing's going to happen. So why would it get any better?
Mm-hmm. That's disheartening, to say the least.
Yeah, for us too.
And how about by you, Maya? And maybe you want to also add maybe another comment. Is there support from any of the other Jewish groups on campus? I know Berkeley has quite the vibrant Jewish life, and you mentioned that also.
Yeah.
Do you get support?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to ask if you have support from them. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. The Jewish community at UC Berkeley is really incredible. And that's why, to anyone listening that's a parent or a prospective student, go to Berkeley. There is incredible Jewish life. We're all so close, and all these instances of anti-Semitism honestly bring us closer together, which is sad but true. Silver linings. So basically we have two pro-Israel groups on campus. We have Tikva and Bears for Israel. Chabad is always super supportive, and so is Hillel. We have all of our club meetings in Hillel. There are a couple Jewish groups, although they don't have a ton of Jewish members, that have been a big issue in terms of pro-Israel activism, and those groups are Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now. And it's really unfortunate because they use their voice as Jews to delegitimize the narrative of the majority of the Jewish population. And I want to make very clear that these people are Jewish. I don't want to take away their Jewish identity. It is okay to be Jewish and anti-Zionist. But the second you take your belief in anti-Zionism and use it to hurt other people in your community, you speak out actively and say, oh, Zionist Jews are bad Jews and I'm a good Jew because I'm an anti-Zionist Jew. You are actively hurting your people. And that's been really hurtful for us, especially because of the whole movement with intersectionality, because it's allowed other student groups to say, oh, well, we don't have a problem with Jews because we have this one Jewish student who is anti-Zionist, and he's on our side, so we can ignore the rest of the Zionist students. So that's the problem you have when you have a minority opinion painting really the entire community.
The token Jew, as it's called.
Yes.
Is there collaboration in London between the Jewish groups, also between universities? There's many universities in London. What's your take on that, Esther?
There's most certainly a collaboration of pro-Israel groups within London. For us, what is really problematic is the collaboration of the student body, often with the anti-Zionist groups. Just to give everyone an example, there was an event hosted at my university, King's College, where we were hosting Israeli ambassador Mark Regev to speak. This was in 2018, and the Palestinians came and they held a protest, holding banners, one of which had the student union logo, branding it and thereby endorsing their protest, stating the Great March of Return, which was on a Palestinian flag in the background. For those who don't know, the Great March of Return consisted of violent riots initiated by the terrorist organization Hamas. Hamas coerced its members, as well as innocent Palestinian civilians, to invade Israel through the Gaza border. So this banner was aimed at honoring the martyrs of the highly publicized event, and their names were written on the banner in both English and Arabic, which was analyzed by Camera Arabic, and 19 of the names featured were directly or indirectly related to terrorist groups. 7 were members of Hamas. So there most definitely are, as Maya has discussed, Jews who are anti-Zionist within these groups, but for us there's most definitely a prevalence of student body and student union collaborating with the anti-Zionist organizations on campus.
Got it. Avi, how about you? You mentioned Jewish groups sometimes standing up, sometimes not. Do they help out sometimes?
Well, I mean, there's only really 1 or 2 Jewish groups on campus, and they all, we're all a very tight-knit club, as we have to be. We're essentially the only space that's friendly even to Jews on campus. So yeah, what can they do? They can protest, and all the protests in the world aren't gonna, do anything when the official bodies governing your university are arrayed against you. And you can send messages and open letters and all this. There's not much that Hillel or Hasbro or any of these other organizations on campus can practically do to help. Now, that being said, all of these organizations on campus have, when there was the riots, they helped keep students safe, and they provided, counseling. And like Maya said, the Jewish community has become much closer on campus, the openly overt Jews, at least, that decide to join. But at this point, what are a bunch of students supposed to do when the student body itself is organizing the protests?
Right. Yeah, no, that's should be hard. I see a question here from in the Q&A section. What is a reoccurring trend and/or theme you've seen in the representation of Israel in international media? What methods have you noticed are being used to promote various anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist causes in the media? Open question to the panelists.
Yeah, I think in the media and on campus and discussions in the classroom, it's very common to paint Israel as a colonialist power, because we talk about how anti-Semitism is a form of hatred that kind of takes the shape of whatever is viewed as evil in the society at the time. And right now, obviously, colonialism is viewed and imperialism is evil. So it makes sense to try to paint the world's only Jewish state and its supporters as people who support white supremacy. They're white colonialists. They want to take over indigenous land and turn it into make it their own. So that's a lot of the common tropes people use, especially, and then they use it in conjunction with white supremacy, which is really hurtful, obviously, because Jews are victims of white supremacy. But those are the tropes that they use to separate Jews and separate the fact that we are victims in history, usually. Yeah, it can be really hurtful.
All right.
I'll just add a little bit to what Maya said. One other thing that I've seen lately is that the accusation now that we're capitalists and that we're now starting to exploit I've heard we were exploiting blacks for money, we're exploiting Palestinians for money, all age-old blood libels that the student body has basically been posting publicly. Actually, the YFS, in response to the riots, banned all Israelis from campus And its rationale was exactly that: we're a white colonialist capitalist power who is exploiting the divisions that we create in minority groups, and therefore it's their duty to oppose us as the student body. That's the main things that I've seen, but I don't know, is it any different in England, Esther?
Unfortunately not. The situation is very similar in England, but we can only hope that we can unite more and, create a, a stronger front against all of this, and, promote the truth, promote the, the many, many benefits of Israel, whether we remove ourselves from the political landscape and talk with our friends about Israeli culture, Israeli music, etc., to really create a greater understanding of Israel and hope more people to formulate a fair and unbiased opinion.
Got it. Those are good points, which actually leads into this question, which will unfortunately be the last. So I do want all the panelists to answer. What message would you share with students who feel intimidated and concerned about being outspoken Zionists on campus?
Find your community. And the Jewish community has just been incredible. I know I keep saying that throughout this entire presentation because I don't want it to be glossed over. The support that I have gotten the moment I stepped onto campus has been incredible. When I had that anti-Semitic professor, I had 2 students from the Jewish community come to my 9 a.m. lecture with me to sit and listen and reassure me that what he was saying was horrible, and just support me throughout the whole process. So it's just a matter of finding people to support you, people who share the same opinions as you, and people that might differ in opinions as you, but are open to hearing what you have to say, because you're not alone in this, even though it can feel like you're alone in it. And once you find that, you'll feel more confident in stepping out and maybe being more outspoken. And it's okay if you don't want to speak out too. Just supporting quietly is also really, really helpful and important.
Esther, what's your take on this? What's your message to concerned Zionist students who are concerned about speaking out and being identified as a Zionist?
I would say, first and foremost, educate yourself, learn the facts, learn the history of Israel. And when you know this, the foundations of your knowledge will ultimately prove your point and prove your arguments, and try and gain confidence. And as Maya said, join Israel societies, and through solidarity, we can really show our presence and respond and have the confidence to respond.
Yeah, very nice. Yafé מאוד. Avi, what's your message to concerned Zionist students on campus in New York?
I would say you have a very good reason to be concerned, but that doesn't absolve you of the responsibility of standing up to evil when you see it. And to quote Begin, or to paraphrase, we're not trembling Jews anymore. We have, thank God, a state and a country. We should be trying to stand up to these forces that are trying to keep us down, and we have a responsibility to do so. Now, that being said, maybe you should do. There are organizations, at least in the U.S., that are student rights organizations, and you do have rights to not feel intimidated on your campus. I'd agree with Maya. Seek out, if you want to be openly Jewish and on campus, realize that this is going to be the situation, and join Jewish organizations that can help you out. Camera, Hillel, anything else that's out there, but be aware you are stepping into a nest of snakes, and it's going to be a fight. But it doesn't mean that we can just roll over and let them have it.
Right. Thank you for that viewpoint. Thank you. Unfortunately, that does wrap up our time. First off, I would like to thank everybody for attending, especially the panelists, but also all the attendees with all the very poignant questions. It was very enlightening for me as an Israeli and as an American immigrant to hear varying viewpoints from different places in the States, in Europe, and Canada. And I hope it was for everybody as well, everybody else. I just want to point out, from what I understood here, these instances of hate on campus that were brought up are all part of the same underlying hatred and contempt for Israel, for Jewry. As Maya said, you can always bring it up and separate the two. Unfortunately, what happens sometimes is that doesn't happen, and it spills over into bigotry and hate. So this just underlies, this points out the necessity of having a unified and tight pro-Israel community, and how important this fact is. That being said, I'd like to thank the co-sponsors who helped sponsor this event. Thank you, Aviva from camera, and also Douglas, of course, on tech. Some quick reminders that were mentioned. You'll be getting an email about all this, but the deadline for the application to our fellowship has been extended to July 1st. This fellowship provides students with the opportunity to hone writing and organizational skills, host events, public speaking, and of course attend our International Student Conference, which this will be held on Zoom, but hopefully next year will be held in person. There's this conference. You must register for the summer in coming weeks. Again, you'll receive links and emails about all this as well. And yes, thank you all. Have a great day.